Okay, so when we're listening to music through loudspeakers in a room, we are hearing more room than loudspeaker. And I know this because Jesco Lohan told me this. And Jesco Lohan is a friend of mine here in Berlin. We've become friends because he's also a room acoustics expert. And I think he was one of the main contributing factors that drove me to first treating this room and then subsequent rooms in Portugal. And I've invited Jesco to talk today. He's going to be sitting in this chair. I'm going to be sitting over there behind the camera, asking him questions about room acoustics, questions that were posed by my patrons. So let's welcome Jesco and let's see what he has to say about room acoustics this time out, because it is quite a dry topic and I think Jesco is excellent at making it less woolly and less dull, really.
This episode is brought to you by T+A, makers of the Solitaire P headphones. Click the link in the show notes for more information.
Do you want to tell us who you are?
Hello, my name is Jesco. I run a YouTube channel and website called AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo.
Could you give us an example of voodoo?
Crystals, sound crystals. I mean, I don't think people are telling outright lies, and apart from maybe the very, very odd case, things that literally don't work at all. But it's more advice that is so specific and outside of the context, the bigger picture of treating a room and a studio in particular, where the goal is obviously to get a sound that audio engineers can work with and that will translate to the outside world, to other speaker systems. So advice that is so specific and kind of out of that context that it has no relation or very little relation to a proper, bigger picture procedure of approaching a room like that. And then that's kind of what I would just kind of define as voodoo in this space. Like for one example is, yeah, diffusion is the secret sauce to making a home studio translate properly. Where it's just like, this is, I don't even know where to start. I mean, it's yes, diffusion is great, it works, but it's the icing on the cake. It has no bearing to the fundamentals of getting the room to translate. So that's one example.
I think what you're talking about there is magic bullets.
Yeah, magic bullets. Well, I mean, again, like diffusion has its place in recording studios, more generally speaking, and I specifically said recording studios, not small home studio mixing project studios, right? So in the world of acoustics, diffusion has its place, but in a DIY home studio treatment process, diffusion really is super unimportant. It's just a tiny fraction of what you can do and what you should be focusing on. And so it's not magic bullets as such, although you're right, some of it might be, but it's a lot about kind of just placing steps in the treatment process in the right place, in their right place, so they actually make sense in the bigger picture. So that's kind of what I would define as voodoo in this case. Yeah.
So a bunch of my patrons put forward questions to ask you specifically about room acoustics. So the first question is, what should the ideal RT60 for hi-fi and home theatre rooms be?
Well, already those are two different types of rooms.
Okay.
Yeah. So already there is no one RT60 for either, for both at the same time. The size of the room matters considerably. So the recommendations you'll get for example, from the European Broadcasting Union on RT60 in certain rooms actually changes with the volume of the room. But as a very more general rule of thumb kind of target, I would say for a home listening space, probably somewhere around kind of 0.4, 0.5 seconds in kind of the mid-range. And then we're not talking bass, we're not talking top end, just kind of the mid-range. And then for a home cinema, I would probably aim for something slightly less than that. But then again, it's so dependent on size. The one thing to keep in mind is just to not obsess about RT60 in any small-ish room, because you don't really get a proper diffuse sound field in these rooms anyway, and even less so if you put some treatment in them. And so you don't have proper RT60, you don't have what is considered like the technical definition of reverb time. You get a decay character of the room, but it's not RT60. And so you're not really looking at the same thing, so it doesn't really make sense to take a hypothetical, theoretical number and apply it to a parameter that is actually happening in the room, but is actually something different. Yeah, so don't obsess too much about RT60. There's definitely something to be said about just how the room feels, yeah, and it's a taste thing as well. So if you find that your room feels too dry, then you need to bring back some reflection. If you feel that your room is still too verby, then bring in some more absorption. I would say that's kind of the more practical approach to judging where you need to end up. And then obviously if you found a reverb character, a reverb decay time in your room that you enjoy, you might actually just do some measurements to see where you ended up, to give you a kind of a ballpark figure. And then you know, I'm someone who prefers drier, I'm someone who prefers more lively, and that will be something that you can kind of take away with you going forward.
I mean, I've certainly obsessed over it in the last few years.
I know.
Thanks to you. I mean, this room we're sitting in right now is about 250 milliseconds.
Right.
In the mid-range, all the way up to about 3K. The room in Portugal, one of them is about 400. Another one's about 350. Mm-hmm. I think I prefer the 300 to 400 range. I think this one is actually a little bit too dry, maybe right now, but that might be a function because it's of it being a smaller room.
Very likely is, yeah.
But I can tell you that this room sounded way worse before I had it treated, and it measured worse. The reverb time of this room before it was treated was, I think, well, some of it was just under a second, some of it was just over. And I know this because I measured my neighbour's room behind the wall behind you.
I remember, yeah.
Because she has the mirrored opposite of this room. And it was...
The difference is crazy.
It sounded awful and it measured horribly. Yeah. Right. So there is some kind of, in my experience, some correlation between what we measure and what we hear in terms of reverb time. I can't say that sometimes. In the mids and the highs.
Sure.
We'll come to the bass in a moment, actually.
Sure.
In fact, that leads me to my next question.
Okay.
What is the Schröder frequency and how does it influence our approach to room treatment?
So the Schröder frequency is the transition frequency between the low end in the frequency response that is dominated by, where the response is dominated by room modes, and then kind of going into the mid-range where the frequency response and the sound in general is dominated by reflections. And so depending on the volume, the size of the room, you can calculate a theoretical number where that transition happens, and that's called the Schröder frequency, I guess, because some guy called Schröder came up with it. I literally do not care about it at all because it's a hypothetical thing. The transition doesn't happen at one frequency; it happens over at least an octave, maybe more. And so there is no one boundary. Yes, in bigger rooms it's going to be lower down in frequency. In smaller rooms it's going to be higher up in frequency. But in general, for me, I don't care at all.
But there is, like you say, there's a range of transitions, right? So from what I've read, it's roughly 100 hertz to 200 hertz. I know there's not a hard and fast number. Yes. It might be here in some rooms or there in other rooms.
Yes. And so, I mean, from when you're looking at kind of traditional treatment approaches, you would say that below the Schröder frequency, you use pressure devices, and above the Schröder frequency, you use velocity absorption. Yeah, so that's kind of a very, very generalized separation between these two frequency ranges. But in practice, so much more is about how much space you have, what you can afford, how adept you are at figuring out how to actually use these methods of treatment. And so in what I teach, I don't focus on it that much because other things are more important than just saying, here's a transition line. Below that, use pressure devices, Helmholtz resonators, membrane traps. Above that, use porous absorption, because that's too simplified. And for most people, it's just not good advice. So that's why for me, again, and also because that transition area is so big, to me, it makes no difference. I wouldn't get too hung up on it. It's interesting just as a concept. I mean, a lot of these concepts in acoustics are good to get an idea of how the sound field is composed and all the different aspects that play into it, and getting a general idea which part of the spectrum they kind of dominate, or they play the largest role. But it gets tricky if you fixate on it too much in small rooms. You got to remember, I'm always talking about small rooms. All this changes completely when you go into large rooms, stadiums, concert halls, all that kind of stuff. Yeah, totally different thing. Yeah, so I'm always talking about small rooms, and in these small rooms, so many other factors dominate the approach that, yes, it's interesting to understand what these concepts are about, but they won't give you a kind of hard set rule on what to do. Unfortunately, yeah, a lot of them are too broad as a tool to be used effectively.
But I think it's interesting for people to know about the Schröder frequency, to understand that there are two main areas to tackle when acoustically treating a room, right? You've got the mids and the highs, and that's generally reflective behavior, and that's what I have tackled in this room. And then you've got the bass, which is, what's the word that you would use to describe low frequencies behavior in a room?
I mean, it's resonant behavior. Let's call it like that. I mean, standing waves, room modes that get created, but it's resonances that build up in the room. Yeah.
So I haven't done very much in this room for that. So I still have bass problems in this room. Sure. I've got over your right-hand shoulder, which we can just about see on camera, I've got some bass trap wedges in that corner, and then a rather odd-looking bass trap that you can't see off to the right. But that's all I've done, and I still have bass problems. But I underline this because I think it's important for people to know that there are these two areas they've got to tackle. Now, I remember when I first spoke to you about this, you said to me, John, really what you should do is treat the bass first. Yes,
I mean, again, I'm talking to studio owners, small rooms. So it's always that caveat to keep in mind. The reason I say that is because bass trapping, bass absorption requires so much volume, so much space in the room, that once you've done what you can do with the available space to do bass trapping, you literally probably have zero space left for any other type of treatment. The reason I say you want to really focus all your energy on bass trapping is because the space that it requires to do something that is reasonably effective is so large, and that's often underestimated, that once you've done that, there's hardly any space left to do any other type of kind of mid and high frequency treatment. The other reason, or the second part of that is that because of the way that we approach small rooms in terms of, again, our knowledge, our skill set of actually using these types of treatment, I advise heavily on using porous absorption, even for the low end. And porous absorption, by its nature, if picked correctly, always also absorbs mids and highs. And so you end up with a broadband absorber, not just a bass trap that you use to absorb bass. And inherently, it will also absorb mids and highs, of which you don't really have kind of enough real estate in a small room anyway. So by the time you've put all that bass trapping in the room, you've definitely done more than enough for the mids and highs, right? So that's kind of why I say focus on bass first, because if you don't, it's not going to happen, period. Once you've put the mids and high absorption in the room and done all the other stuff, you will not be able to do enough bass absorption to even get remotely enough control that you want. Yeah, so it's the biggest thing to focus on. If you go higher up the food chain in acoustics, people building dedicated studios in the kind of 5 or 6 figures kind of scale, they will invest 80% of that budget into controlling everything below 100 hertz. You just got to keep and that's so something to wrap your head around. That's how difficult it is, because it requires an approach, a holistic approach of the entire room from the start to be able to get full control of the low end. And if you don't do that, you can only get so far. That's kind of where we all land, us DIYers. We can only get so far. And even within the realm of what we got, once you've because there's so little we can do, or it's barely going to be enough. Even the maximum that we do is going to be barely going to be enough. And so you got to max out bass trapping, bass absorption, if you want to even have a remote chance of actually having a decent low end in a small room.
Let's move on to another question. This is a bit of a long one.
Maybe let me just quickly throw in before that. That's also one of the reasons why I focus purely on giving advice to studio owners. That's why I don't do hi-fi listening rooms, because they will not like what I have to say. And it's just like, it's like, here's the solution. Oh, I don't want to do that. And then we're just like, okay, then we're kind of done here, you know? So there's the priorities that people have for their listening rooms, which are often their living rooms, which are often very much integrated into their living spaces in a more general fashion. And I totally get it. Mm-hmm. Which is why I don't give advice I don't offer advice to that part of the kind of audio space. Yeah, I'd have to play psychologist first of all when I'm just like, well, no, look, my focus is elsewhere. I want to help people who who are so dependent, who are dependent on the sound of the room because they make their living using that sound, you know, and it's just they just have different priorities. Yeah. And so oftentimes they're actually willing to do what it takes. While with a person who's treating their living room, you know, they have to ask their partner first whether this thing looks good. And I'm just like, well.
Yeah, the next question is actually related to what you've just said. So obviously these questions are all coming from what we might loosely call hi-fi enthusiasts or audiophiles. So it goes as follows. If you could only treat one surface, so limited by budget or aesthetic considerations or your landlord or your better half, what would be the single best treatment to tame the most typical issues, e.g. the front wall behind the speakers or the back wall behind the listening position? And I'll also throw in the ceiling there as well.
Very good, because that's the one I would go for. Unless you can't put any treatment on the ceiling, I'm always a proponent of doing as much as possible under the ceiling. That's usually the one surface that you have that you fully have available, and if you have a high enough ceiling, you can put rather deep absorption under the ceiling, and that, if nothing else, is going to control a good amount of low end. Not all of it, but a good amount of it. It's gonna just reduce the overall decay time in the room significantly, and those two in combination, while not stealing any relevant space that you're using in a day-to-day fashion, makes it the first one to look at. Unfortunately, it's obviously stupid. No, that's not stupid, but unfortunately, it's unpleasant and difficult to mount absorption under the ceiling. That's obviously the flip side of that coin. Because
so in here it was done with frames that were drilled into the ceiling. Yeah. But in Portugal they're just like styrofoam blocks, and also I think, foam padding absorbers that were just glued, super glued to the ceiling,
Yeah.
and then held up with supports for like 10 minutes,
Yeah.
and obviously they haven't come down. So it's not as, here it was quite onerous, but in Portugal not at all.
Mm-hmm.
It was very, very easy, and I think it doesn't have to be super visually intrusive. I mean, obviously you can purchase acoustic treatments from various companies that are designed to be invisible, but the less the less you see them, the more expensive they are, the more you feel them in your wallet, right?
Yeah, and I mean, just to make it clear, that obviously doesn't do anything or doesn't do much for reflection control, which is very beneficial in order to kind of clean up the soundstage, make things more precise. It doesn't do anything for boundary interference related problems. It's a compromise. If you're asking for a compromise, this is the compromise that I'm giving. Yeah? So is it going to fix all your issues? Definitely not. But it hopefully, if you do enough treatment under there, it will control some low end. Just because if you make it deep enough, and also just because of the sheer size, surface area coverage under the ceiling, and then obviously again the reverb thing, reducing the reverb time, which as a kind of a more general concept, obviously just means less sound bouncing around in the room, which can mess with your perception. Yeah, it is sort of reflection control. It's just not early reflection control.
Next question from another patron is there value in treating only one of the sidewalls?
Unless you have, let's say it differently. If you have a very unbalanced stereo image because the left and right surfaces do not reflect in the same way, then obviously there is merit in treating only one wall, trying to get it to mimic the other wall as much as possible. Right. Yeah, because symmetry, in my opinion, is definitely more important than having some absorption on one side. Yeah? Or somehow putting absorption in the room, but only having it on one side, because the shift in the stereo image that you will get will be significant, and you will notice it, and it's far more important to get symmetry than it is to have a little bit of absorption in the room and just having it on one side.
Someone told me that a listening room that opens out on one side into a dining area or some other kind of area of a similar size, or maybe a little bit smaller, is incredibly difficult to treat properly. Is this true?
Well, my gut reaction would be no. So what does an adjacent room to your listening space do acoustically? Well, it feeds in a certain amount of low-level reverb that comes in kind of at lower level and very much delayed in relation to the direct sound that you're hearing. So basically what you get is you get a two-step reverb pattern. So the decay, you get like the initial decay of one room, of the space that you're in, and then the second one starts feeding in once the level of the first one is low enough, because it's about ratios, right? So once the ratio of the reverb from the adjacent room is high enough in relation to the reverb in the room that you're in, it'll start becoming part of that character, of that decay pattern. And but it won't do much in terms of early reflections, because it's not going to give you early reflections unless there's some inconvenient geometry in there. In terms of low end, yes, it will affect the pattern of standing waves, room modes, resonances, and that's as a general rule. I'm not going to really comment on that because it's not predictable. I can't say with any definitive way, this is how it's going to change. It's going to change it in some way. How? Who knows? But so the consequence in terms of treatment means just block off that adjacent room. And if you don't want to put a door there or just build a wall, then something like a noise, like a noise isolating curtain can definitely help. Yeah, it's not going to be perfect, but it'll definitely help. Yeah, you always got to remember with all of these things, it's for some reason, and I used to think of it like this as well, and I don't quite understand why we keep thinking of it that way, that it's always black and white. We always think of problem solved or unsolved. In acoustics, it's never about problem solved or unsolved. It's always about how far towards the solution are we going to get. And getting 50% towards the solution, halfway there, is a great improvement. And for many people, that's going to be enough. Yeah? So always ask yourself, how much can I improve this? Not, can I completely fix it? Because you will not be able to completely fix it, yeah? most generally speaking. So the question just becomes, how far can I get to fixing it along that path? And is that good enough? And in many cases, it probably will be.
So next question is, how effective are curtains as wall treatments instead of acoustic panels?
Well, they're very effective. You always got to remember, it's not so much about, well, the prime factors that affect how well the treatment works is the surface area covered and the absorption coefficient, or in more simple terms, how much of the spectrum we're absorbing with that treatment. So it's surface area times the absorption coefficient or the frequency range absorbed. The more the merrier. So more frequency range covered, and typically that means how far down into the low end can we get, is a good improvement. And then you need to cover surface area with that. The more surface area you cover, the better. A large curtain covers a huge amount of surface area. If you drape it right, it can easily work down into the low hundreds in terms of frequency. Makes for a great mid to high frequency range absorber. Do you like having a draped curtain hanging along the entire side wall of your room? Now we're coming back to the whole looks and aesthetics question, yeah? But that's not that wasn't kind of the question here.
No,
so
you're not here for looks.
I'm not here for looks, yeah? But so long answer short, yeah, it works great if you use the right type of curtain, which is made to absorb sound. There are acoustic curtains that are built for this, designed. And if you drape it right, if you hang it right, it works great. Covers a lot of surface area, so it's going to be very effective.
Next question, are there other decorative treatments that one might consider, such as furniture, to achieve room treatment goals?
Yes. So, as always, coming back to fundamentals, think about surface area covered times absorption coefficient. A couch, which I have right here in front of me, it's made of fabric, it's got some sort of pillow inside. That's going to absorb sound. Is it going to be great at absorbing sound? Not particularly, but it does. But on top of that, it is fairly large in terms of surface area. Yeah. So a couch in an empty room, just think about like moving into your new place and start by putting the couch in the room and just have a think about how that possibly affects the sound. You will be able to tell the difference. Yeah. So sure.
It's funny you say that, because my experience doesn't work with that, because when I first moved into the apartment in Portugal, the first thing I bought was an IKEA couch and a rug. Yeah. Now I do have a tiled floor there, but I put those in and it made almost no difference whatsoever. I mean, it's a big room. Probably
because your particular couch did not actually have a good material to absorb sound.
So this is where I'm trying to get to, right? So the way I see it is that the absorption coefficient of, say, the acoustic panels I have on my walls are predictable and known.
That's right.
Whereas the couch,
that's right,
we're not provided that. IKEA doesn't give us that information about their furniture.
No.
Because why would they? They're not insane.
Yeah.
Or any other furniture manufacturer doesn't give you the absorption coefficient.
That's right.
Like a rug that's underneath your chair right now. We'll come to that in a moment. But these things are not predictable. So you could slap a whole bunch of furniture into a room and you might get a good result, but you might not. And it's a bit of a lottery, isn't it?
It's a bit of a lottery. I mean, it will, especially if we're talking about more furniture than that, it will surely change things. It will somewhat improve things. Again, we're talking about how much. And if you're just using furniture, maybe 10, 20% beyond just the naked, empty, bare walls. But that's probably as far as you can reliably expect things to change. Yeah, like you said, it's a bit of a gamble. Yeah, there are well, it's the same, for example, people ask me in the studio world, can I just use some old mattresses? And it's just like, yes, you can. Great surface area, but you don't really know what the absorption of that mattress is going to look like. Is it going to improve things? Yeah. How much? Probably not that much. A little bit. It depends on the mattress. You might be lucky. But I teach things, I try to teach things of which I know they work. I can say with a certain amount of reliability, if you do this thing, it's going to work within reason. Yeah? And so that's why I don't recommend you use your old mattresses in your studio, because yes, it might work, but it might not. That's why I don't tell you to build your own resonance absorbers, because, well, in this case, chances are it won't work. Yeah, but I recommend things that work reliably, because I want people to actually get back to making music. And so, long story short, yes, again, it's a how much question. Furniture, I would probably, don't quote me on this, but it's probably going to improve things by maybe 10 to 20%. Yeah. It's not
going to be a huge amount, is it?
It's not going to be a huge amount, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know there is something in it, but...
Yeah. That's what I'm saying. You can tell, but is it going to be better, like to an extent where you say this is a solid improvement? Probably not.
Well, you mentioned the sort of black and white thinking that tends to sort of permeate this conversation. I see it a lot when people write comments along the lines of, well, I've got all this furniture in my room and that is just, I'm quoting it, just as good as having wall treatments. And my response mentally, privately, if I'm even saying it publicly here, is bullshit. There's no way it can be. Especially when you don't have something on the ceiling, as we previously discussed, and especially when your furniture's absorption coefficient at different frequencies isn't known. So maybe a couch might be great in the mid bass, but terrible in the uppermost frequencies. I don't know, probably would be pretty good in that as well.
And it also, I mean, if they say it's what did they say? What did you say? It's just as good.
Just as good as having a professional fit out.
Did they actually say as a professional fit out? Because
well, yeah, I mean, because I was talking about professional fit out, and they're going, okay, my furniture in my room will produces just as good a result.
Right.
As a result.
Right. Because it also comes down to expectations. I mean, if this person doesn't really have any experience in what it actually means to listen to music in a very well-treated room, first of all, their goals aren't set as high. They don't really know what they're aiming for. And then they might actually be happy with far less treatment. Right. And so they say, with my very basic requirements for the room, this is just as good. And I'll say, great, good for you, enjoy.
Percentage-wise, roughly, when we're sat in a room listening to a pair of loudspeakers, how much is the room and how much is other speakers?
Yeah, I think we touched on that on our interview. In
a few years ago,
whenever that happened. So I can't remember exactly what I said back then, but I would probably say, I mean, especially when we're talking about these kind of distances here, where you're in a small room, you're 2/3 of the room's length away from the speaker, you're probably hearing somewhere around 30% speaker and 70% room.
Yeah.
Probably something like that, I would say. Yeah, it's very difficult to say exactly, because our ears are very good. Our hearing apparatus is very good at isolating what actually comes out of the speaker, right? So you can still obviously tell that sound is coming from the speaker, but in terms of the amount of distortion that the room adds to the sound from the speakers, it is massive. And especially when we're talking about the frequency response, the decay time. I mean, those are all more room dependent than speaker dependent. Like all things being equal, the amount that the room distorts the speakers is absolutely massive. I mean, you can have basically a flat a speaker measuring flat, but you put it in the wrong space, as in you put it in the wrong room, you put it in the wrong spot in the room, you sit in the wrong spot in the room, and then it's completely empty, and it will be completely unrecognizable. Yeah, I mean, just as a thought experiment, think about the difference of having the speakers, listening to the speakers where they are now, and then putting them on the floor in the corner. Yeah, I mean, it's you can't even listen to it that way. Like it is so distorted. And when I say distorted, I mean changed. Yeah, the technical term would be distortion. So it is so distorted that you literally you don't want to listen to them anymore. Yeah, so that's how large an effect the room can have. That's why it's so important to work with positioning and work with the room and let the room kind of tell you what you need to do with the speakers if you want to get as close as possible to a balanced sound from your speakers.
So let's say this room was empty, right? Let's say it was like a normally furnished living room, right? So there'd be pictures on the walls, there'd be no treatments, no acoustic treatments, nothing on the ceiling. It's going to be more reverberant in the mids and the highs. How much of that would I be able to mitigate with speaker position and listening position?
In terms of decay, very little. But what you can do, as in a general decay response of the room, but what you can do is get closer to your speakers in order to change the ratio of direct energy versus reflected energy. Yeah, so this is the typical moving into the near field, which I'm sure no hi-fi person ever has done anywhere.
You'd be amazed actually the number of hi-fi people that have rooms smaller than this. This is 6 meters by 5 meters. I get emails and comments all the time like my room's 4 by 3 or my room's 3 by 2, often because they've been relegated to a spare bedroom or something like that by their financial controllers. And so they have very small rooms. So a lot of them are kind of listening effectively near field. I'm not saying everybody does. When I first moved in here, that's exactly what I did. I had the speakers much further into the room. Actually, I was firing the other way. Yeah. And the couch much further into the room.
Yeah, it works. And I mean, in an empty room, I mean, you'd be surprised how close to the speakers you need to get in order for this to get to the standard that I would recommend for professional use. Yeah. Obviously, you have more flexibility if you're just there for enjoyment, if you're just listening for enjoyment. But so that's one, it's the distance to the speakers, and then the location of the listening position, more than anything for the low end, because those resonances, those room modes will develop a certain pattern in the room that is fundamentally, to the largest extent, dependent on just the shape of the room, the dimensions of the room, the shape of the room. And so yes, it changes somewhat. Which of those resonances gets the most energy changes somewhat with speaker positioning, but it's less than you would expect. So in the end, where you place yourself within that overlapping resonant pattern of all those room modes to the largest extent is going to dictate what low end balance you're going to get. And that's, for example, where that guideline of placing your listening position at 38% of the length of the room comes from, which I'm sure is permeated to the hi-fi world as well. Yeah. So basically, it just means that in terms of the length mode of the room, so the fundamental resonance between the front and back wall, at 38% of the length of the room, you will get the right amount of energy from that standing wave. And so there are two spots, one towards the front and one towards the back, where you can potentially get that balance. It all breaks apart and falls apart once the symmetry of the room is broken up, once or the shape of the room is broken up, once you have a non-shoebox shaped room, once there are angled walls, once the walls aren't 100% reflective and actually let some of the bass escape. All those things will affect that room mode pattern. And so I still follow the same concept when I teach people how to place their listening position. You still want to find that spot that I call the low-end sweet spot, but in many cases it's not going to be at 38% length of the room. It might be somewhere completely different, and especially obviously if you have an L-shaped room, for example, or just one that isn't cuboid, isn't a rectangle in one way or the other, you can't rely on this theory anymore at all. You still want to find that spot, but you need to use a different technique. You need to kind of use the actual room mode pattern in the room, play some music into it, and figure out where that spot is. And so that's something that I teach my students as a starting point in order to find that low-end sweet spot and place their listening position.
But in finding the optimal speaker position and listening position, you cannot do anything about the inherent reverberant behavior of the room?
Not really. You can change, like I said, with the distance, you can change the ratio of what you're hearing between direct sound and reflected sound, but the reverb is going to be what the reverb is going to be.
All right, let's move on. This is one that comes up a lot, actually. How effective, you've made a video about this actually, how effective are rugs in preventing floor bounce?
Almost no effect. Got to remember that floor bounce is a low frequency phenomenon. Yeah, so it's a reflection that usually is going to appear somewhere in around the 100 hertz mark, and a rug does not absorb 100 hertz. Therefore, it is ineffective at doing anything about the floor bounce. It'll change it a little bit depending on the size of the carpet, but again, we're talking about how much, and so probably somewhere maybe between 0 to 10%, right? Whatever that's worth, and well, in that case, you could, for all intent and purposes, it doesn't do anything. Something that I didn't mention before when we're talking about furniture in the room, it's all frequency or slash wavelength dependent as well, right? So one thing that I keep saying over and over is, when you're thinking about whether an object interacts with the sound, just think about how big it is. And the size will tell you what equivalent wavelength will see this object. Yeah? So if you have a big closet in the room, for example, yes, low frequencies up to a wavelength equivalent to the diameter of that closet, frequencies starting with a wavelength of the diameter of that closet will see that closet, but very low frequencies will not see that closet. So let's say we're talking about a standard closet, 3 meter diameter, 3 meter 50 is about 100 hertz wavelength. So anything below 100 hertz will not really see this closet, won't really interact with it, it will just bend around it. So the lowest room modes are not really going to be affected by even a closet. Yes, a little bit. Again, it's a question of how much, but not nearly as much as you'd think. Yeah? So always keep that in perspective. Is this little thing going to cause a problem? Well, if it's a little thing, that means we're talking about small wavelengths. So at best, it's going to affect very high frequencies. Yeah, so that's kind of how you can very quickly judge whether something in the room is going to have an effect, just by looking at its dimensions, its size.
So one thing I'm still a little bit hazy on, this is something I don't fully understand still, and I should, but in terms of bass frequencies and walls, right? So in this room, all the walls are concrete, and they're probably like 25 centimeters thick, right? Now, the dimensions of the room, so front to back, as people are seeing you right now, is, I think this is I've forgotten, it's been ages since I measured it. Let's call it 5.5 meters, right? We will ignore the ceiling height for the time being, just to keep it simple. So if a bass frequency has a wavelength longer than 5 meters,
Yes.
does that all exit the room, or does some of it fold back?
So you're just basically asking what happens to frequencies that have a wavelength that is longer than the dimensions of the room.
Exactly.
Yeah, so simple answer is that obviously they still play, it's just that they won't form resonances. They won't form standing waves because they don't fit perfectly in the dimensions. So what happens instead is that the overall pressure, sound pressure at that frequency increases. Yeah, so the way I kind of try and the image I try by putting people's heads is, imagine a dollhouse, and then you put a balloon into one of the rooms, and then you inflate one of the balloons. It's going to increase the pressure on the walls in general, all over. And then because that pressure can't go anywhere, it's actually going to increase the sound pressure overall in the room at that frequency. It doesn't create a resonance. It just goes,
Okay.
the whole room just goes.
So basically what you're saying is that, I mean, I've got a room mode in here of about 33 hertz. So whatever the wavelength is of 33 hertz, it corresponds to one of the dimensions of this room.
That's right.
Almost exactly, right?
Yeah. I mean, 33 hertz is probably going to be a bit higher than that. So 100 hertz is 3.5 meters. So 50 hertz is about, 7 meters?
Right.
Yeah, so I would expect the lowest frequency room mode to be somewhere around 60 hertz.
It really isn't. It's well, maybe it's
Oh, well, it's half wavelength. So
yeah,
that's why.
maybe it's the half.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
but it's most problematic at
Yeah.
33.
Yeah.
At 60 something, there's a bit of a bump, but it's not nowhere near as pronounced as at 33.
Yeah, it's probably because it's half a cycle.
Right.
So
okay.
Yeah, so it just goes whoop.
So it's where it's a complete cycle, it's an exact fit, or half a cycle, it's an exact fit, or I guess a quarter as well.
No,
no?
quarter won't work. No.
So just half and full.
Yeah, because you have to have the nodes, the pressure nodes at each end.
Gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. Right. Okay. Well, I've hijacked the conversation long enough. Let's move on to patron questions. How much of a problem are large windows, and would having double glazing make a difference?
So let's just take it back a step and think about what a double glazed or a window is. It is a reflecting surface. Yeah. Standard single glazed windows actually let low frequencies pass, and they start being reflective kind of up from the middle base, a higher base upwards. So it's basically just a wall down to some frequency at which point it lets base seep through. Long story short, I always say think of a window just like drywall. Because drywall will do the same thing. It'll basically reflect mids and highs, single layer drywall, and it will let most of the low frequencies pass through. And windows kind of do the same thing. Yes, double glazed the more panes of glass you have, the less base it's going to let pass through, and basically the more it's going to be like a concrete wall. Yeah? So double glazed, triple glazed will let far less base through. They will still let base through, but far less. Yeah? So we're basically just moving towards what basically amounts to a reflective wall.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's why, from a treatment perspective, I don't look at a window in any different way, very generally speaking, than any other surface in the room, because it basically behaves the same way. Yeah. The questions with windows are more related to, am I willing to block the light if I need to put some absorption in that spot, because that's where early reflections happen, or because I want to do some corner base trapping, and so I need to put some base traps that kind of sit in front of part of the window. You know, it's always the window question is more a, am I willing to block the light question, rather than a, do they somehow do something differently than other parts of the other surfaces in the room.
So that brings us to the next question, which is, there is a window behind my head. How do I avoid creating harsh reflections?
Put some absorption. Yeah.
So would a curtain be like a big thick curtain, a big sound absorbing curtain, be the best solution there?
Well, if it absorbs down low enough in frequency, sure. Yeah.
Because then you can pull it back when you're not listening and still enjoy some of your daylight, right?
Yeah.
With an acoustic panel,
Yeah.
it's kind of a pain to take them on and off the wall.
I mean, you got to consider with windows that sometimes old windows, if they're not mounted properly, or some newer windows as well. I've had the very, very, very occasional experience that a window does something very weird to the reflected energy, but it tends to be very noticeable. And so if it is a problem, you will notice it, and then the standard answer is yes, some form of absorption on top. Yeah, and again the question then becomes, are you willing to sacrifice the light? Yeah, and then yes, curtains might be a solution. Yeah?
Is it better to listen to music in a small symmetrical room or an irregularly wider one?
So the question is small or wide? That's
yeah, it's a bit of an odd question. I guess small and symmetrical. So I guess that means equally wide and long versus, but I don't know what irregularly wide means. But I guess we're talking about like a corridor room versus a square room, right?
Generally speaking, the bigger the better. Although going from a 16 square meter room to an 18 square meter room probably isn't going to do much. Yeah. Still, the bigger the better. If you have an option for a bigger room, bigger volume, larger volume, always go for the larger volume, because that will give you more space for treatment, even if it's only a slight size increase in comparison to the smaller room. That said, It's impossible to answer by default.
Sure.
I think it's.
Let me ask you a related question. Right?
Yeah.
This is something to do with speaker placement. Is if you have a room that is wider than it is deep, is it best to fire across the room, so long wall to long wall, or is it best to have the speakers firing down the room, so short wall to short wall?
Again, there's no. Well, people will say fire down the long side, the long length of the room, for the main reason that the back wall will be further behind you, energy reflecting back will take longer to get back to you. Also, because this having to set up at this 38%, round about 38% of the length will give you more space to the front wall. That said, in practice, unless the room is the walls are fully reflective, both of these concepts are going to somewhat break apart. And there are instances where it makes more sense to orient your setup towards the long wall, so firing down the short length. Why? Because again, the main thing in a studio scenario, at least, the main thing you need to do if you want to get a balanced low end is set up your listening position in this spot where the room modes balance out. Right. And where that spot is so dependent on the actual room that you're in, with the way it's constructed, the materials that are used, the dimensions, the shape, so that you need to test the room to figure out where that spot is. In many cases, it will be facing a short wall, but there are also just as many instances where it makes, in the majority of instances, it will make more sense to fire down the long side, the length of the room, and facing the short wall. But there are enough examples where it makes more sense to face the long wall, fire down the short length, because that low end sweet spot, that spot where the room modes balance out, actually is better in that orientation than in the other orientation. Yeah? Okay. So, long story short, in the majority of cases, or in most cases, it will be that standard rule of thumb, but it is a rule of thumb. And if you really want to nail down your low end, if you've got problems in your low end, you need to test the low end pattern, the standing wave pattern, and then find your room's low end sweet spot. And then it will be what it will be. You're going to have to follow what the room tells you. Otherwise, you're not going to get the balanced low end.
Given the level of correction now possible in DSP, what are the advantages of treating the room versus introducing DSP into the system? Big question, I know. Yeah,
the inherent in that question is that it is one or the other. Right? That's
possibly, yeah.
Yeah, and my immediate answer is it's not one or the other. Do both. Yeah, they both have their place in the process of treating a room. Right? I've been talking about listening position, and I've been talking about placing your listening position. We've been talking about speaker placement. We've talked about treatment. Now we're talking about equalization systems, room correction systems. And they all work together, ideally. Yeah. So if you think about it from a step-by-step process, placing your listening position sets the initial balance of your low end. Placing your speakers sets the initial sound stage. Doing the treatment then controls the reverb, the distortion effect the room has on the speakers. It's going to improve what you already laid out to have with the placement. So that's the next step. But you can only get so far with the treatment and the placement of the correct placement of your listening position and speakers. And so you can then pick up the slack, pick up what you may not be able to do in terms of at least tonal balance with equalization. So it's do this first, then do as much as you can with placement, then do as much as you can with treatment, then do as much as you need with EQ. Yeah. If you can't do the treatment step in the middle, the EQ step at the end has to work harder. It's a compromise. Yeah? If you can't do the placement thing at the beginning, the treatment and the EQ will have to work harder. Chances are you won't be able to get to a spot where it's it really works, from my opinion. That's how important the positioning aspect is. But they all work together, and ideally they all do their part. And sure, if you do the first and the second step as best as you can, and they're really optimal, you might not even need EQ. But especially in smaller rooms, asymmetrical rooms, oddly shaped rooms, poor dimensions, the EQ can pick up the slack, pick up the remaining problems with tonal imbalance that you weren't able to fully correct or get to with just placement and treatment. So it's not an either or question. It's how do you get the best of both worlds? Primarily, these room correction systems do tonal control, right? They do basically slap an EQ on the speaker. So it's frequency response correction. Some of them also do time correction, but they're not correcting the time response of the room. Because obviously once the sound has left the speaker, it's going to start bouncing around the room in the way that the room dictates it, right? And no matter of messing around with how the sound leaves the speaker is going to change the fact that the room has 5 surfaces and 6 surfaces or whatever, and the sound is going to bounce around those surfaces, right? So some of these systems do offer time control, but all they do is control or correct how the sound leaves the speaker, at what time the sound leaves the speaker, right? So a standard analog speaker, in a standard analog speaker, the low end does not leave the speaker at the same time as the high end. The low end is massively delayed in comparison to the high end, right? And this is the phase response of the speaker. And typical kind of standard 2-way, 3-way designs therefore have a very specific phase response. And if you design a standard speaker with standard crossovers, anybody who designs a speaker will know what the phase response of a standard design looks like. And so what you can do is you can correct for the fact that the sound doesn't all leave the speaker at the same time. Yeah, so what you do is you delay the top end, so then is in line, in time, with the low end again. And so everything leaves the speaker at the same time, instead of it going, you know?
But does that also mean that those DSP systems can, say, delay one speaker more than the other in certain frequencies, so that what you hear in the listening position is time aligned? Right?
That's right.
And therefore, this is why it improves the soundstage imaging specificity of what the placement of players.
That's right. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah.
I mean, I'm a big fan of DSP, not for reverb correction because it can't do it, but I mean, you talked about like this either-or dichotomy that people tend to introduce into the conversation, and I'm with you. Like, I don't think it is an either-or. I think it's like this and this. And I use DSP to correct for bass problems in this room because physical treatments, or the physical treatments that I would need to correct those bass problems are absolutely abhorrent to me in terms of their size and how many I would need. So that's where DSP is very useful. But it's usually below the Schröder frequency, and then above the Schröder frequency I have all the shit on the ceilings and the walls. That's my own experience. I'm pretty sure most recording studios would have their treatments dialed in to such an extent that they wouldn't need DSP.
You'd be surprised.
Right. Okay. Okay. All right. I mean, but I guess what I'm getting at here is that the DSP is the icing on the cake, right?
Yeah.
You put the treatments in. I mean, if you're in a professional listening environment, and then you might tweak it with DSP afterwards, especially with time alignment and maybe the odd sort of frequency anomaly here and there, just to kind of finesse it, right? Is that how most professionals look at it, would you say? Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, I would take it further than saying it's the icing on the cake. I would say it is a useful tool when, in particular, your room dimensions are too suboptimal and also just too small in order to do a significant amount of treatment and get a tonal balance that is good enough to work with, right? So the tonal balance that you get from the speaker, the overall tonal balance, is largely dependent on the shape of the room. Yeah? And if that shape is not optimized or is suboptimal to the extent that you can't get the tonality of the sound to where it's good enough, even with significant treatment, then your only option is to use EQ. And I think that's fine, especially in home studios. Yeah? If you're treating a bedroom, a basement, whatever, you need to work with the room dimensions that you have. And in some instances, in many instances, doing some final touch-up with EQ is beneficial.
For late night listening, would having good small monitors and a sub very close to the listening position eliminate standing waves and wall reflections?
No. So the response of the room does not change with volume within limits, but so your perception, the how you perceive the sound changes with volume, but the actual acoustic response of the room does not change with volume. You cannot get rid of standing waves or reflections by changing the volume.
Once a room is treated, is it good for all speaker types, or would you need to change it for certain speaker types, e.g. open baffle, planars, electrostats or horns?
This is completely outside of my world. Unfortunately, I cannot answer that because I know next to nothing about these types of speakers.
Well, I guess the only speaker that I think would help you if you were trying to, I say battle the room because it is a battle, but, parcel delivery, excuse me, Jesco, sorry.
Go for it.
A few moments later.
There are certain speakers like the Key 3, like the Dutch and Dutch HC, which I know you are familiar with both of those, that have the cardioid dispersion, which is, I guess, a useful feature to have. I mean, I've tested both those speakers in this room before it was treated as it is now, and they're great solutions, but I guess, yeah, they're probably going to be better suited to a problematic room than normal, say, not like the normal speakers you're seeing behind you.
And I mean, in some extent, again, it just comes down to a question of how much, right? So they will somewhat improve the low-end response from the get-go. So that means you don't need as much low-end treatment, yeah? And that's obviously a good thing, yeah? But yeah, I haven't worked with these speakers directly before, so I can't really comment on how, for example, how dependent they are on correct positioning, right? So I think one of these, at least, is supposed to go directly on the wall, if I remember correctly.
That's the Dutch and Dutch. It's directly couples to the real, the front wall. Yeah.
So they're meant to go right on the wall. But let's say that front wall is just one layer of drywall. Yeah. How is that going to affect the sound? And in comparison to putting them right up against thick concrete, for example. Yeah. So there are again many questions here that affect the how much effect are you going to get, and so I can't really comment on that. Yeah.
Oh, fair enough.
Yeah.
Does the kind of music a person primarily listens to play any role when planning room treatment?
Sure. I mean, I have to keep it vague because it is a taste question, the type of music that you listen to, and the types of rooms that will better support that music. But as a very general idea, think about this, right? Gregorian choir was made to be performed in large cathedrals because of the way that the reverb in the space keeps notes sustaining them to the extent that the singers can actually layer their voices on top of the decay, the reverb in the space. Yeah. So obviously, the ideal space to listen to Gregorian choir is a large cathedral. Yeah? And if you just take that as an idea, as a concept, it will probably apply to much lesser degree, but it will also apply to all other genres of music, right? So I'm sure that once you get into do I need to change the acoustics in my room, whether I listen to kind of techno or drum and bass, yeah, maybe, I don't know, but
you've hit on an important point here. Actually, this was covered extensively by David Byrne in his book How Music Works, and how changing environments in which music was played for the public down the centuries had an effect on the type of music that was made. But if you have let's say you listen to a lot of very simple music, like the Gregorian chants, but also let's say it's a female vocal with a guitar, the reverb in a room is less likely to trouble you as, say, if you're playing very complex metal music, right, where there's lots going on, and the reverb is going to be really noticeable than with simpler music, right?
I mean, because there's masking going on, right?
Right.
So the reverb is going to mask the sound at the instant that it leaves the speaker, or rather that it arrives at your ear. And if the music has less complexity from a signal perspective, then the reverb has less to mess with, right? And if it's very complex music, very high-paced music with lots going on, then the chance that the masking actually affects the perception of the music is probably higher. The least distortion from a room is going to be a room that doesn't exist. If you put your speakers right out on a field, you're going to listen to only the response of the speaker, potentially whatever bounces back from the ground. But if you're in a field, that's probably going to be not that much. Yeah. So at that point, you're going to be listening to pure speaker. You're going to get the response of the speaker. You're going to get the time response of the speaker. You're going to get the low end extension of the speaker. Yeah. And if you open up your existing room, especially the low end resonances or some of the low end resonances won't be able to build up, and so you're kind of moving the sound from a conceptual point of view towards what happens in the free field. You're on that path towards a free field. And so in a way, you're just moving closer to a pure speaker listening experience. In this case, more low end than mids and high end. But so that can obviously be perceived as tighter bass, more even bass.
But don't we need a room? I mean, we don't. I mean, you're saying the ideal is to listen out in a field, but don't you?
I'm trying to use this as a thought experiment. Yeah, whether it's pleasurable is a completely different question. Yeah, but if you want to listen to pure speaker, put them out in a field, and you'll be able to listen to pure speaker. Are you going to enjoy it? I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting experience for sure. Yeah.
This is a great argument for headphones, isn't it?
Yeah, headphones have their place. Yeah, for sure.
On that note, Jesco Lohan, thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks for inviting me, John. You're very welcome.